Willkommen zurück beim Deutsch-Französischen.
Welcome back at the Franco-German Energy Forum. We are right ahead of our last session, and it will be even more exciting than the other sessions. We will be talking about money. How will the energy transition be financed? But before the debate, we will hear a keynote address by Professor Claudia Kempfert. Claudia Kempfert is the head of the Department for Energy, Transport and the Environment at the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin, and she's also a member of the expert committee concerning environmental questions at the Federal Ministry for the Environment. She will talk about green growth as a way out of the crisis, question mark. So she will talk about prospects concerning decarbonization post-COVID-19. She will address us by video, so we won't have any sound problems. So let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to address you on the occasion of the Franco-German Energy Forum today. I would like to particularly talk about the opportunities involved in a possible green growth, a fresh start from the crisis. This can entail and is an opportunity for climate protection and sustainability. There can be no doubt we are in the middle of a severe crisis, but climate change will be the next global crisis. The climate crisis and the COVID-19 crisis might be very different. However, they also have some things in common. Academia has warned of pandemics for a long time, and academia has come up with respective scenarios. There have been warnings of climate change, and we are seeing them now and today. Countries who have drawn political consequences from these warnings get better through the current crisis. I'm thinking, for example, of dikes against rising sea levels or irrigation systems in the times of droughts. Flatten the curve. This applies both to the COVID-19 and the climate crisis. We have to take action today in order to prevent the crises of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. The more we restrict injection possibilities and the earlier we curb emissions, the more time we will gain. The COVID-19 crisis has almost brought the entire economy to a standstill. This can be seen from gross world product. Oil prices have also significantly fallen. Global energy demand during the first quarter of 2020 compared to 2019 has decreased by almost 4%. In the EU, this figure was even at 5%. However, concerning other energy sources, especially when it comes to fossil energy sources, there has been a significant decrease in demand. However, renewables are among the only energies where demand has increased, and this is irrespective of the duration of a shutdown or the extent of recovery. However, annual growth rates of almost all renewable energies have decreased over the last 3 years. The European Green Deal can contribute to the fact that the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic can be mitigated. There might even be positive effects from a fresh start from the crisis. One thing is key. The European Green Deal focuses on solidarity. Nobody should be left behind. And this also applies to all the measures that have been developed and introduced. The European Green Deal, therefore, is an integral part of the fresh start from the crisis when it comes to sustainability and more climate protection. Ladies and gentlemen, what we need is the following: a healthy environment, a healthy climate, a healthy economy, and a healthy society. A fresh start from the crisis. This can be used for achieving these very goals. The investments that we decide on today, the fresh start from the crisis, can be defined as an opportunity to reach our goals concerning climate protection, but also the development of a healthy and green economy. And I'm also thinking of a healthy society that stands for solidarity. We can tackle crises together, and I think that the COVID-19 crisis makes this apparent. The next crisis is right at our doorstep if we don't take action. Global greenhouse gas emissions have to be significantly reduced. What you can see here is how this can be successful by way of 3 columns. Firstly, improvement of energy efficiency. And this first and foremost means a significant reduction of energy consumption. And this applies to all sectors. I'm not only talking about buildings energy efficiency, where this is key, but I'm also talking about the transport sector and industry. The second column relates to the development of renewable energies. They have to significantly grow. Fossil energies have to be replaced with renewable energies, and this also means that we need to see electrification, especially of buildings, energy efficiency, but also when it comes to the transport sector in order to reach these goals. This means that green power generated by renewable energy will be used for buildings energy efficiency, but also for the transport sector. Consider railway transport, but also e-mobility. Railroad transport should be significantly further developed, particularly when it comes to local public transport, but we also need to further develop charging infrastructure for e-mobility. So these are our 3 building blocks. We need to save energy, we have to develop renewable energies, and we have to see electrification by way of green power across the board. One thing has become apparent from the COVID-19 crisis. We can't engage in business as usual. What we need is change, especially when it comes to a climate-friendly economy. We need a non-carbon, secure and affordable energy supply on the basis of renewable energies. We also need to see sustainable green mobility, and this means traffic avoidance, a shift in traffic, and an improvement in traffic. We need to see a shift from road traffic to railroad traffic, and we also need to enhance e-mobility. It is also key to save energy. Energy that is not consumed is good energy. And the following does not only apply to Germany, but to all of Europe. We also need to see further development of infrastructure, charging infrastructure, railroad structure, sustainable energy infrastructure in the broadest sense of the word. I'm thinking of green hydrogen and other energy infrastructures that stand for an entire decarbonization of our economies. These means massive investments in climate protection, but it also means that these investments create economic growth. Those sectors need to be strengthened that are key for a climate-neutral economy. I've already mentioned some renewables, but I'm also thinking of energy efficiency technologies and technologies for a climate-neutral economy, and the sustainable shift towards e-mobility and climate protection technologies are key here. Comparing international stimulus packages, it can be seen that they are too brown, and brown stands for harmful to the climate. Green stands for climate friendly. It becomes apparent here that most countries still pour a lot of money into conventional energies. And that means that we are seeing path dependencies that rather prefer climate damaging technologies instead of future-oriented, climate-friendly technologies. However, the European Commission at an international level does well. especially the European Green Deal has a focus on sustainability and climate protection, and this is the right approach. Climate protection stands for the way out of the crisis, and climate protection means that we have sustainable, competitive economies that stand for full energy supply on the basis of renewables. And we can also see that some countries in Europe do quite well too. However, Germany is not really among them. Germany does not do enough for the green economy, and I will talk more about this later. A fresh start from the crisis. This can entail opportunities for the 4 Ds: decarbonization, digitization, decentralization, and democratization. Decarbonization, I've already touched on this. We need a significant decrease in carbon emissions across all sectors. All economic sectors, including the industry, have to be carbon free. To achieve this, we need manifold change. This goes hand in hand with digitization, because this is key when it comes to reaching these goals, especially when it comes to achieving interconnection in the context of the energy transmission. And I'm also thinking of optimal load management or the interconnection of decentralized prosumers. This also includes decentralization, because different from the past, we are no longer talking about single decentralized power plants, but centralized renewables that can be coupled as team players. Every building can be part of the solution here if this very building is a prosumer. And that means that the buildings produce more energy than they consume as part of a centralized approach. Democratization stands for the fact that we need a strengthening of democracy in order to seize the opportunities that we have. During the corona crisis, we have seen that we need strong democracies. Strong democracies get better through or are able to master the crisis better. And this also applies to other crises. Democracy stands for decentralized participation and independence from fossil energy wars at a global level. So the strengthening of democracy really holds significant opportunities. The stimulus package of the federal government of Germany focuses on a short-time economic stabilization. We're talking about around 50 measures, and they can contribute to a short-time stabilization of consumer demand. However, we need more comprehensive investments, especially in climate protection. It would be desirable to see a strengthening of investment capacity. Weaknesses of the private economy concerning investments is not addressed enough. During the first quarter of 2020, equipment investments have decreased by almost 10% year over year. However, the German economy can only recover quickly and can only achieve important structural change if private investments over the next months can be stabilized more over the next months. Public and municipal investments, when it comes to improving infrastructures, are also key. An investment program strengthens growth potential and, first and foremost, the resilience of the German economy. And this can also contribute to the repayment of incurred debt in the future. Investment programs also stabilize overall demand and therefore stand for economic recovery. So this entails the opportunity to make the German economy sustainable and to support the energy transition. We also need to see a shift towards digitalization and sustainability. This needs more deliberate and targeted support by a much swifter development of renewable energies. We need solar premiums so that we can achieve a true shift towards green mobility. This would really make sense. Conventional powertrains should no longer be subsidized. No, we should see a more focus on local public transport, cycling, and walking in order to implement the shift towards green mobility. Ladies and gentlemen, we are only at the beginning when it comes to committed climate protection. With the European Green Deal, the EU and Germany can lead the way when it comes to international climate protection. A fresh start from the crisis. This is an opportunity for climate protection and sustainability, especially when it comes to the development of renewables. The energy transition, or this can tackle three crises: the existing economic crisis through a fresh start and investments in future technologies. Secondly, the energy transition, which can be resilient and like this can be independent from future shocks and crises, and we can prevent the climate crisis by investing in sustainability and climate protection now. We have to seize these opportunities, otherwise we will pay for coming out of this crisis by the next crisis. The year of 2020 might be a tipping point. It might be the year where irreversible climate protection started. It is high time we engaged in this. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for having the opportunity to address you today. I wish you an interesting debate now. Maybe as an introduction to your debate, one question might be particularly interesting. It is often said that we cannot afford climate protection, particularly not during times of crises. But can we afford to not engage in climate protection? I'm looking forward to your answers. Thank you for your attention. Have a great conference. All the best to you. Thank you, Claudia Kempfert, Head of the Department for Energy Transport and the Environment at the German Institute for Economic Research. Thank you for this input. This leads us on to the question what the costs of the energy transition are. Claudia Kempfert has asked us whether we can afford to not engage in climate protection. I am Claudia Ulrich, correspondent in the ARD Capital Studio. So let's look into this question during our panel. A green recovery, can this be a way out of the climate crisis? How can we finance the energy transition? We have 4 experts with us here today. They stand for sustainable change in the context of finance, and they support new ways. So let me introduce our 4 panelists. Sandrine Crozet from the European Investment Bank. It calls itself the Climate Bank of the EU. Sandrine Crozet is the director of the Operations Directorate for the Baltic Sea and Northern Europe. Just transition post-COVID. She's an expert in that, and I'm looking very forward to her contributions concerning the question how important investments in climate protection have come and respective developments at the European Investment Bank. Welcome to you, Sandrine Crozet. Alexandra Palt is also here. She works for L'Oréal. She is responsible for sustainability. Ms. Palt is a legal expert. She was a lawyer focused on human rights questions. She wants to change things. She has been working for L'Oréal since 2012. This summer, L'Oréal has launched a new initiative for more sustainability 2030. L'Oréal has also defined ecological goals to avoid litter, goals concerning water consumption, and Ms. Polt says that we need to make beauty sustainable and that sustainability needs to be beautiful. And I will ask her how she wants to achieve this. Welcome to Ms. Polt. Jan Lagalay is a partner in the investment fund of Demeter, an important actor when it comes to risk equity. Demeter Partner does not only provide funds, but it also supports companies when it comes to developing strategies that are sustainable. Jan Lagalay is an engineer, and he says that Demeter Partners are pioneers, and he will tell us more about that later. Welcome to you too, Mr. Lagalay. Last but not least, Ernst Rauch. He is with Munich Re, a reinsurer, and he is responsible for climate matters. He is a geophysicist. He's an expert for the analysis of natural disasters. Today, he's responsible for climate matters at Munich Re. He will talk about changes in his company concerning these questions. Welcome to you, Mr. Rauch. We will start this debate with our panel now, but we are also looking forward to your questions. So if you have questions, please write them down in the chat. During the last 15 minutes, we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible.
I'd like to come back to what Claudia Kempfert said to us. How can we pay in this crisis climate protection? Can we actually afford that? Or is it actually rather in this crisis that we need to do this? Now, I would like to give the floor first to Sandrine Crozet of the European Investment Bank, because about 1/3 of your funds have gone towards climate financing. You wish to increase this. Do you feel that it's sufficient, the sort of monies that you earmark for this purpose?
Madame Crozet, ich höre gerade, dass man Sie hier noch... Sie haben Ihr Mikro eingeschaltet. Wunderbar. Dann bin ich jetzt still und die Frage nochmal an Sie.
Okay, apparently they switched you on, so now the question to you. What's going to happen?
I think we can always do better. And that's what we decided to do. As you were saying, historically speaking, about 25% of our funding was dedicated to the climate. And we announced that we are going to increase that share to 50% of our financing by 2025. That will be a bit more than 30 billion euros a year. So you can always do better.
But again, the question addressed to you as well, wouldn't it be even more costly to put a brake on things and to do less? So is doing actually more perhaps in the end much more economical for the EIB?
Dans quel sens? In what sense? Perhaps you could explain your question a bit more precisely.
Well, they say right now in this COVID-19 crisis that we cannot really afford to also pay something towards climate protection. But I feel that your bank has always taken a different view. You said right now is the moment to invest. And you've already said that you're going to do more now. Perhaps you can give us a few examples where you feel these investments have become even more important.
Oui, bien sûr. Of course. Yes, we currently have an unprecedented crisis, and there's a big temptation to focus basic funds on a short-term response. Nevertheless, at the EIB, we are an institution that lends long-term, very long-term, and we have a perspective that extends towards perhaps a bigger horizon than current politics. In the same way that the European Commission, which is our partner in many projects, has a vision for Europe with the decarbonization by 2050, we are trying to guide our activities towards, what shall we say, the same target. The question is, can we afford to miss this opportunity that is being presented? No, we feel, for two reasons. The first is that the 10 years or so ahead are going to be crucial in the world's ability to tackle the climate challenge. So it's extremely important to start now, because the longer we wait, the less wiggle room we're going to have to reduce the average increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's the first reason. The second reason, at the moment we're in an economic cycle where a certain number of industries have to take some crossroads decisions. For example, in vehicle manufacturing, very important decisions are currently being made, or have already been made, about electrifying the range of light vehicles on offer. But that's not the only sector. If you look at energy production, in steel production, there's an investment cycle now coming up with assets reaching the end of their service life. So these industries that have a very long tail investment cycle need to know now what they're planning to do. There are hundreds of millions of euros they're planning to invest. Are they going to go down the road towards a decarbonized economy? Or can they allow themselves to invest in something that may be less helpful to the climate? But once that investment has been decided and implemented, they won't have a second opportunity for a long time to come. They will have missed a window of opportunity. And that's why it's extremely important to think about it now.
Frau Palt, Sie würde ich das auch gerne fragen.
Ms. Palt, that's a question I'd like to address to you as well, because we're talking about the survival of a company. What does this mean for L'Oréal in this present situation?
Moi, j'ai envie de me poser la question dans des termes un peu...
I would like to put that question in rather less pessimistic terms, perhaps a bit less negative, because we've really heard enough of bad news. So what we're planning to do is to say we should be able to devote our economic activities to things that the planet can actually manage. So if we're talking about climate, that means we need to have carbon emissions aligned to scientifically based targets. We don't want global heating to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that rebounds onto other questions, such as how we use resources, and it also has implications for ambitious targets for remaining within these safe operating space for humanity kind of targets. And that, of course, calls for some commitment, some transformation, some change in our economic model, in the way we do things. It's a transition. What I don't like is when people talk about an initiative or a project. That's not our logic. We think we have to transform our economic model. We have to transform everyone's economic model because we're planning to go down another road here. We can't go on assuming that we have infinite resources to use up. That's not the case. So we have to adopt a different economic model which will enable us to combine economic activity so that we can create the ability for more and more people to exit poverty, generate opportunity for everyone, but remain within those planetary limits. Of course, those are constraints and it's difficult and there are lots of complex issues there, but it's also an opportunity for innovation. For us, for example, taking this transformation as a springboard is very significant because 95% of our ingredients in 2030 are going to come from what we call green science. Green science. That is biotechnology, green chemistry, natural ingredients, and so forth. Of course, that's a total transformation in everything we're doing. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to do it so that we can respect those planetary limits. That is essential if the human race is to survive.
Thank you very much, Ms. Paul, for this first impression, and we'll get to that later on. Monsieur Lagallet, how important is to you green finance in the world of today, in the financial world in general?
Moi, je vois, enfin, je vais parler dans mon univers qui est quand même le financement des startups.
I've been thinking about startup financing in the broader sense.
Sandrine Crozet est beaucoup plus compétente que moi.
I think Sandrine Crozet lives in a much more complex world than me, but if we're looking at financing innovation, which is important for the energy and environmental transition, the part that needs to shift to green, look, BlackRock has made this announcement as well in terms of green investment. We're seeing a major U-turn here, with the capital markets turning towards green investment, and that's a big step in structural terms. So there's a greater awareness now across the economy that financing needs to be impact-oriented. But we still need innovation. And that means we have to finance those transformations, those essential changes. In the first two periods of ecological transition, we've seen new technologies emerge, such as solar and wind power, or new developments in batteries, which are helping to solve the problem of balancing load and interrupted load. That's important. And now we have to look at the penetration of renewable energies. We're entering a new phase where people are using smart digital technologies to transform the value chain in our industry. Whether those are resources producers or consumers, but it's being transformed, this value chain. And to do that, we need a digital revolution which enables people to access these chains. It's very expensive at the moment. The challenge now is going to be to exploit what we have so that we can transform people's habits, change the way we function economically. Our challenge in the technologies that we're investing in now is to transform that value chain so that we're talking about a greater spectrum of services and products being accessible. Whether we're talking about sharing mobility, platforms for this. In Asia, we've seen a big growth in that. Sharing mobility is one thing, electrifying mobility, decentralizing energy so that we can consume it more efficiently, like they've been doing in Germany. To answer that challenge, I think that's your question, really. We think that we have to create European champions. And what we're planning to do is work. We're looking for a partner at the moment for a joint venture where we can do this, which will have many implications for Europe in terms of the transformation. We want to help our society, our industries to tackle this change. We've tackled a lot of challenges successfully in the past. It's important to have the right technologies. We've got the renewables now, so the potential is there, but the value chain needs to shift, and there are a lot of carbon-intensive industries that still stand to gain from this.
Quite a lot of input there, and we can later on go into the details of that. Now, that brings me to Mr. Rauch, because an insurance company against natural disasters such as Munich Re, well, obviously climate change, at least trying to stop climate change, can be a matter of life or death. Will it very soon, Mr. Rauch, become too expensive to insure yourself against these risks? Thank you very much, and my greetings from Munich to you. In our insurance company, we have covered ever since the 70s damage from the natural disasters. So as regards damage from natural disasters such as storms, such as floods, and we see that there are a number of regions in the world where we haven't seen an increasing damage situation, for example, from environmental and climate change incidences, and that after a normalization, once we sort of apply the yardstick of today, there is a very clear tendency, and that indicates to us that there are certain regions in the world, and that is, I need to issue this caveat because you cannot say this for all of the regions in this world. We see increasing disasters, increasing catastrophes that we see are due to climate change to a certain fairly large extent. And if this tendency goes on, if this trend goes on and perhaps manifests itself in other parts of the world where so far it has not yet become so apparent, then in about 5 or 10 years to come, we shall have a situation where the question of can one actually insure oneself against these risks, against hail, against heavy rains, against drought, against flooding, well, this needs to be sort of brought in line with can I actually afford this from a social point of view? So not so much can I insure myself against these risks because these situations are unfolding in the way that I describe them. It is more a sort of social dimension that comes into play. And this is obviously something that to which you cannot give an answer that is applicable to the whole world. You have to differentiate according to regions, according to countries, according to dangers such as, for example, droughts or wildfires, as we've seen them in California and other parts of the world. In certain parts of the world, they play an important role, in others less so. Now, to get back to your original question, this question of a change in the risk environment is certainly one that has something to do with pricing, and we need to come up with a response to that. Is a private industry willing to bear these risks, and also is it possible? Is it from a social point of view? So it's not that much of a supply side question. But does that mean that already now you do see that there are companies that think very long and hard about where they actually set up their headquarters, for example, simply because for climate reasons? Yes, that's true. But that's a development that we've only seen for a number of years, a few years, let's say the last 3 to 4 years. If you look back 20 years ago, this was not an issue. These days, the risks entailed by choosing a certain headquarters do play an increasing role, and also because the oversight, financial oversight authorities are increasingly asking that particular question. And when you have this perspective of certain climate scenarios until 2030, 2050, and you know there is going to be a rise in sea level, there's going to be a problem with water supply, there's going to be an increasing risk, then companies do have to factor that in with their capital investment. They have to look at the location, for example, of manufacturing sites. And that means additional risk to such a company. In the future, there will probably have to be, in line with their reporting requirements, be also regulations then that demand from that to analyze those risks better, and to also then take their decisions as regards locations as a consequence of these increasing environmental risks. Thank you. That's interesting. Interesting, particularly when in the past you rather looked at whether there is sufficient skilled labor there. Now you look at these kinds of things, those inform your investment decisions. Now, I'd like to ask Ms. Crozet of the EIB, how do you actually evaluate what is sustainable and what are sustainable investments for which you give money? What are the criteria? Madame Crozet?
Thank you. Yes, when we look at the projects, we have a multidisciplinary team. So we have engineers, economists, finances who look at the projects, right? We also have, in the projects we fund, they have to make economic sense, they have to be profitable, but part of the analysis takes into account factors such as carbon emissions, carbon footprint, and our projects are now always subjected to an assessment with regard to climate risks. For example, if we're funding the construction of a new railway along a river, we're going to look at whether in the next 10 years that railway is likely to be flooded. So is this a good investment? Are the technical characteristics also taking account of changes in the climate? The other aspect, in a more general way, is that this approach is not only used for a case-by-case approach to our projects, but we have a number of policy guidelines that we have to review now and then. So by the end of this year, we'll be looking to see to what extent our activities are in line with the Paris Agreement to make sure that all EIB-funded projects are either climate neutral or make a positive contribution to solving the problem.
And on this, again, a short question as to the more ambitious goals that the European Commission is planning, and the fact that there is much more money in the recovery plan. Is that giving you a new sort of momentum, or is this too much of a huge sum for you to really feel this in a tangible way?
No, of course, as we are Europe's bank, we work in collaboration with the Commission for a very big share of our activity, and our role is to support the European Union's policy decisions. So the climate ambitions set by the EU, the European Union, which are reflected in the big recovery fund with these 5 billion, are going to have an impact on the EIB too, because we're working on the same basis, including the European taxonomy, which is currently being implemented for green investments, but also because these measures taken by the Commission contain a number of financial mechanisms which enable the EIB to support riskier projects. For example, for projects which are not entirely mature, because perhaps the technology is very innovative, and we are able, through our assessment, to support the project based on a kind of risk alleviation mechanism. This is very important for us, and it's a big program. So the EIB is loaning 63 billion euros a year. It's a huge terrain.
L'Oréal,
L'Oréal and Ms. Pult, largest cosmetics company in the world, and you, Ms. Pult, have already told us that you have committed yourself to changing your business model. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your new sustainability program that you launched in June of this year. What exactly does that mean to your customers? What do you want to change as regards your product range? You talked about ingredients that are changing, but I think it goes beyond that, doesn't it?
Yes, we have a first generation of sustainable transformation for the period up to 2020. That first period has enabled us, for example, to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% in our manufacturing. That has enabled us also to evaluate our environmental profile in 2020. We've reviewed 80% of our products, and we've reduced energy consumption by 50%. So we've already done quite a lot. But of course, we're aware that that's only the start of it, because the transformation is going to go much deeper and be much more ambitious than what we've done so far. So now we've announced the second generation approach for this transformation from 2020 to 2030. And on the one hand, we have the objective of being 100% carbon neutral in our own self-auditing. That is our manufacturing sites, our distribution centers, our research centers, our administrative offices, and so forth. And also we're going to tackle this big third tier in the taxonomy, the way the carbon footprint is expressed through our suppliers and in the products that we're selling to our consumers. So, for example, if you, for our shower products that we're selling to consumer, if you're taking a shower with hot water, the energy you need to heat that water is a factor and will also generate carbon emissions. So that is part of our value chain. And we need to be able to respond to that through innovation. We're currently marketing solid shampoos, for example, shampoo bars, shampoos that take less time to rinse out. All these things can play a part for the consumer. But we also have to bear in mind biodiversity, not only the climate. I've already talked about natural ingredients, which are sourced sustainably. But there's also water. And again, we need local policies. We all have local policies in all the countries where L'Oréal worked. If we're going to use resources, we want to make sure that by 2030 we're not using any plastics that is not recycled, for example.
Well, that's something for which you invest quite a lot of money. But how important is this also to give a boost to your competitiveness, to make your brand L'Oréal more competitive?
Bon, donc, bien sûr, c'est une transformation qui va...
We're talking about a transformation that's going to happen everywhere. There'll be those who go down that path early, And this is perhaps one of the success factors in L'Oréal over the last 50, 60 years, that we're aware of many things, but there's another element. This is a transformation that is part of our economic model. So it's not an additional, it's not an add-on, it's not just a way of doing business. Tomorrow everything's got to be sustainable or it won't be happening. We're talking about transforming the economic model, and that calls for investment. But as ever, I think we've said it often enough, and I'm sorry if we repeat ourselves, but unfortunately, people don't always believe what they know. So sometimes there's a bit of a gap between what people know about climate change and the consequences this has for our societies. And this gap between understanding and acting is a challenge. We know that it's real. We know that the biggest danger for our business is doing nothing, because a company is not going to work in a society that doesn't work. So I don't see... I think COVID has shown us this very clearly. We've seen that the systemic crisis that we're currently going through, it's had a huge impact on business, on companies. Add that into the climate change, it's going to make it all much more serious, much more systematic.
Before we concentrate on perhaps the opportunities of such disruptive events such as COVID-19, and we ask our panelists to comment on this and where these opportunities are precisely, I'd like to come back to Mr. Rauch, because you, after all, have to earn money, have you not? With Munich Re, you described to us what sort of criteria companies will apply in searching for locations. But what about no longer investing in fossils? What is your policy as Munich Re on this? Well, this year in 2020, we associated ourselves with the Net Asset Alliance that has an aim to, as regards all of our capital investments over the next 3 decades, to only invest in climate neutral investments. So really back the Paris pathway as regards our capital investments. We will sort of reshuffle that. Our first steps have already been taken of divesting, that is to say, divesting certain capital investments, for example, from coal-intensive investments that we are phasing out. And a similar strategy, a similar way of procedure is something that we start in our underwriting. You know, our business model is taking over liabilities and risks, but that means we will no longer underwrite, for example, coal-fired power plants. But we are convinced that this will not be sufficient, only refraining from doing certain things, that is to say, divesting certain capital investments in fossil areas, for example, not entering liability underwritings for certain fossil projects. This will not be sufficient in order to get a grip on this and try to reach the goals enshrined in the climate agreement. So disabling will not be sufficient, but we also are grappling with the question as to how we as insurers, as those who bear risks, as who invest, can strengthen the enabling side. It's actually quite simple when you talk about capital investments, for example, that have to be simply shifted along or reshuffled in the direction of battery technology, renewables, green technology. That's something that we do. But our core business as a reinsurer and an insurer is to assess risks of new technologies and to underwrite them. For example, solar, hydrogen, batteries, cells. And we do this and have covered that and are exploring this and developing it as a new area for our expertise. And in this way, we are able to better assess those risks and to also take them into our portfolio, and then assure also others that we can actually invest in those areas, and that pension funds also can invest in that, and so that we scale up the investments quite significantly. So that is something that we're doing, that we want to do. That is to say, risks from new technologies. I mentioned renewables, but you can also, for example, think of a completely new state-of-the-art hydrogen, for example, to be used in the future in the steel production, to try and increase the possibility for others to invest in those areas. And that's something that we're trying to do. We're trying to also tell our customers to invest in this. We are partners of industry, of companies, and try to convince them of this. And what was also necessary, my last point, to actually achieve marketability of new technologies, for example, solar, is to take over long-lasting guarantees where you can no longer, even today, you cannot say that you can actually ensure, for example, a nuclear power plant for the next 20 years, and that there will be a certain amount of performance to be installed. But you can this these days with renewables, and that is one new area for business for us. When you say the risks, taking over risks of new sources of energy, to what extent is it important that that is also something that where you get the support of the realm of politics? We said this in the first panel, for example, on battery research into hydrogen and its possibilities. Governments all over Europe are participating in these endeavors. To what extent is this important for you as well? Well, many of these developments of these new technologies have started with R&D, as you quite rightly said. Basic research, as in other technology areas outside of renewables or outside of green technology, is happening, and that has always happened. It is not a German phenomenon, not a European phenomenon. But practical implementation, so the use for private industries, and for private industry to also taking over research until it is a marketable product that emerges, that needs to be supported, obviously, by political stakeholders. And here it's most important that the political stakeholders remain credible, and that they remain also credible and continue to support all along the way the industry in order to achieve decarbonization, to achieve the climate goals. All of those targets that one has committed oneself to in Paris, that one also adopts the necessary rules and regulations to make it possible for investors to invest. And only when there is predictability for the investor, when there is also a credible product, then this will be possible to be scaled up. Having trust in long-term political policies, we're talking about 3 decades here, that is the basis, a very, very important basis, a crucial basis indeed for further measures and predictability. Otherwise, investments in the private sector will simply not be taken out. And this is not only true for green technology, it is basically true for any kind of technology. You have to know what is the political priority, what sort of targets do we reach, can we trust that in 20, 30 years over this period there has to be a radical transformation. And I think that perhaps has not yet been fully grasped, that in 3 decades trying to transform an infrastructure that was built up by coal-fired power plants. And it's not only about electricity generation, it's also about heating. And this cannot, what sort of fuel will we use in 2030? And saying then we'll continue to use oil and coal. That will not be sufficient for meeting the Paris climate targets. Well, that is a very clear appeal. Predictability is necessary for investors, reliability. What's also important is something that Monsieur Lagalais said earlier on, namely your gains in efficiency. I'd like to get back to that, Monsieur Lagalais. So what is it what you have in mind? Not only more, but more efficient, you said. What do you think needs to be the new reorientation so as to transform our economy and our industry as well?
Il y a énormément d'efficacité dans plein de domaines.
There's a huge amount of efficiency that can be gained in lots of different fields. Of course, energy efficiency, that's about processes, the way we can improve our consumption in industry. But something that's also important is efficiency of the use of resources. We're consuming resources, let's say,
fabriquer une voiture et la consommer à son client qui est réellement consommée. Donc 99% de
in manufacturing vehicles, for example, we have huge resource leakage through inefficiency. So we have to look at the way we consume, the way we produce, the way we use resources. It's all thoroughly inefficient, and efficiency gains are vital. What can we do to achieve that? Technology, because technologies enable us to improve the efficiency, but we also need to change habits. The benefits that we have, we need to link digitalization with behavior. Maybe people want to buy things faster, okay, but we can also use digitalization for greater transparency so that we can see better our supply chains throughout industry, so that we can use digital data to improve many processes. This digital training has become a huge field now, so that we can customize many of our products right along the chain. We're seeing this in industry, mobility, logistics, in our energy consumption in general. And this is one of the quickest vectors that we have available to achieve certain targets, whether it's 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5. The more efficiency we have, the quicker we can achieve this. We can achieve it other ways, but it might take longer.
Many people simply say that efficiency gains will not be sufficient. One has to have a far more profound transformation of what that's something that Ms. Palt addressed. I just wanted to tell you that in the case that you're listening in, please don't hesitate to ask questions to our panelists in our chat. And I see the first question here. I see this, so I think maybe it's an ideal question for Madame Crozet. How can one ensure that investors outside of the European Union too invest more in green projects, those outside of the European Union? Do you have ways and means to do that, or is it simply not your business?
C'est forcément c'est l'affaire de tous.
It's everybody's business. But of course, we also try to influence behavior outside the European Union. The EIB also is active outside the EU through about 10% of our activities. Of course, climate is not a European issue, it's a global issue. And potentially, of course, the leverage effects of some investments are bigger in some regions where there are still a lot of carbon-intensive operations, rather more than in Europe, perhaps, where some work has already been done. So I would say the importance also lies with coordination at international level between different institutions that fund developing countries, and these institutions work together to agree on common terms. That also means that if you want to draw on these institutions, there are public aid policies that need to be aligned and must cover all activities, all investments, including rules for how you prioritize some activities over other. So yes, the EIB also makes an effort to work beyond the European Union. At the moment, we're waiting a little because we work on the basis of facilities that are made available to member states by the Commission, and the multi-annual financial plan is still being discussed. So the existing facilities are going to expire at the end of this year, and what we need to know now is what means are we going to be able to make available in following years. But it's very important. We've also, of course, we've got big countries like the United States, China, Japan, where, of course, the scope for influencing decisions is limited for the European Investment Bank. But as far as the rest of the world is concerned, fine. It's not at all the case that we're not interested in what happens beyond our garden fence.
Well, that was clear and unequivocal. I'd be interested, now that we have moved a little bit outside Europe, climate change quite often actually affects the emerging economies and also developing countries the hardest. That's something that Mr. Rauch has already mentioned. Probably ensuring risks, underwriting risks there is even more difficult. Industrialized nations right now seem to actually benefit from that. So such a just transition in the energy transition, what sort of ideas this plays also, what sort of role this plays also in the ideas of companies? You were speaking about supply chains earlier on. How important is such a social component and such a social criterion also for your company?
Oui, bien sûr, ça c'est aussi.
Well, of course, it's can also be explained in terms of the history of a French company with a strong tradition of social commitment in France. So major pledges, statutory commitments in terms of insurance, maternity leave. You know that in France, there's a lot of support for women working, a lot of support from employers too. So we decided that this same social model should be applied everywhere across the world with all our partners. And we've always said that the universalization of our business strategy plays a part. That means respecting diversity, but also generalizing our social model. So we're evolving best practice, including best social practice across the world in various countries where we're active. So that includes insurance, sickness leave, health protection, maternity protection, leave for fathers as well, and continuing professional development. But it's not just inside the company. This is also about our impact on the value chain, and we've worked a great deal so that by the end of 2020 we will have integrated more than 15,000 people in our value chain, not just at Oriel. People who are working for suppliers, who are able to take training. And we're very committed to this very inclusive society because we shouldn't forget that this ecological transition needs to also improve inclusiveness in society. It's very simple. It sounds a bit trivial, but if people don't eat, they're not going to be bothered about climate change. So our aim is also to do all we can to make sure that societies are inclusive, are more just, more fair, so that this ecological transition is supported by these processes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Palt. I now see another question from our audience, and perhaps that is something from Monsieur Lagalais. Is the risk today higher to invest in new technologies that are not yet mature, or in fossil energies, where later on you will run the risk of actually, have new regulation to contend with? So what would you say? What would your comment be, Monsieur Lagalais?
There's a theoretical answer to that and a political answer to that. I would say that the risk is much bigger if you're going to invest in fossil-based technologies. But of course the other risks are there. Risking in a transformation technology these days is, okay, there's a risk, but it's essential to do it. Because if we don't do it, we're going to pay a much bigger price in the future. And that is a calculation which isn't based on exact figures, but we need to work on solutions that will enable us to transform and to work better. Otherwise, we're going to pay a much bigger price. COVID is nothing compared with what climate change is going to do to our society in future years. We have carbon capture. We know, if you look at the effect on migration, thousands of people who are being displaced by wars over resources and things. What are the costs of not doing anything about that? We know that. So all the capital that we have should be invested in this direction. I don't know if that's an answer.
Yes. I think that answers the question, because that is a very clear appeal to each and everyone to invest in these new technologies. Now, I'd be interested to hear whether you feel that the majority of companies has understood this message, or whether it needs a stronger political message. And I'd like to ask Mr. Rauch to answer that question. I'm not really in a position to tell you whether it's already a majority of companies that is dealing with this in any serious way. But what we are seeing is that there's an exponential growth of companies that deal with this question. Had you asked me that question a few years ago, then I think I would have told you a few, in many cases, global players are actually pushed by their shareholders, by their investors to go in this direction. SMEs have then later on followed suit. Today, the movement is so dynamic as it's never been before, as far as I can see. So we see more and more companies looking into this matter, dealing with this matter, looking as to the risks that climate change brings for them, but also as regards future investments. And then they're seeking answers, of course. And I think that's a very positive development. I would expect, against the background of the talks I had with companies, that they will commit themselves in future even more to climate strategies. They not only do this to the outside, to shareholders, but they will also implement this inside of the company. So there's the right direction. The speed is also appropriate, but it is an extremely steep learning curve because 40 gigatons per year to draw that down to zero until by 2030, 2040, that is indeed a radical change. It's not just a little bit, it's just something that is huge, both in the electricity generation and in heat.
Danke, Herr Rauch. Und ich würde jetzt für die Schlussrunde Sie noch mal alle vier wirklich zu einer ganz, ganz kurzen Antwort.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rauch. I would like to, in this last round, ask all of you to give us just a brief answer to the following question. If you look at the climate crisis under the Corona conditions. Do you see this more as a danger or more as an opportunity? Perhaps we should start with Madame Crozet, Ms. Palt, Monsieur Lagallet, and then Mr. Rauch in the end. So are you rather optimistic as to this economic model needs to be transformed, or are you rather taking a pessimistic view about the chances of that happening?
Je suis optimiste.
I'm an optimist because, for a start, we have a very strong political will here, which we cannot, no one's denying it. And also we have general support from society, which is increasing. And the last thing, as has already been said, the crisis that we're currently witnessing has also shown that it was important to always bear in mind the global dimension of things. And the effects on nature that have been observed during lockdown show people that by reducing human activity, we've actually achieved some very fast positive changes.
Excellent. So you are more optimistic. Now, Alexandra Pat, what would your comment be, very briefly?
I'm going to answer optimistically, but only because Churchill said it seems to be the only reasonable option left, because we've tried everything else, and it just leads to inertia. So we have to stay optimistic. It's true that we get the impression that there is a political will, but it's no longer about will. It's about speeding up, it's about speed. Are we going to be able to act as quickly as we need to or not? And for the time being, it doesn't look too positive, or at least I'm a little bit mitigated.
Okay. Monsieur Lagallet, what's your comment?
I think there is a need for huge discussion about this, but just talking won't get us anywhere. We need people to come up with solutions, and the players who can provide those solutions are important. So for the transformation to happen, these people have to be encouraged, and it's up to all of us to adapt our habits. I think that's a rather more complicated problem. There's an awareness that's there, but moving on to action in our everyday behavior at work, at home, this is the challenge for moving ahead. I'm an optimist, of course.
And the third optimist we've heard, but you feel that there ought to be a change of momentum and of behavior. But then, Mr. Rauch, please. Well, it can work. It is very ambitious, and it's less about transforming our economic model and our business models, but transforming all our technology that we're using these days to generate energy. Well, that seems to, thank you very much to all of our panelists. That seems to be a rather optimistic round about the transformation of our societies and financing of our energy sector. We're not at the end of it, and Barbara Kostolnik is now with us again. I'd like to thank all of my panelists for participating. Thank you. Thank you, all of the panelists. In the end, there was an optimistic outlook that the panel took. Now, I am very much looking forward to welcoming Professor Klaus Töpfer, former Minister of the Environment, Executive Director of the Environmental Program of the United Nations, and member of the Kyoto Hall of Fame, which is only appropriate. So, Mr. Töpfer, I hope that you can hear us. I hope that you can see us. I hope that you're well equipped and can now share with us your ideas about the post-COVID energy transition, and maybe you too have an optimistic outlook for us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to conclude today's event. Pessimists are disinformed optimists. This is a popular saying. I hope that you can hear me. Yes, we can hear you very well. Great. So I don't want to be an informed pessimist, but let me make two preliminary remarks. Firstly, it is great that this conference has taken place, especially at the Foreign Office, because we are talking about a matter of geopolitical importance. An open, democratic, parliamentary society can perform better than a dictatorship that thinks that questions like these can be pushed through. In Wuhan, COVID-19 has come to an end. There was a celebration yesterday. But we are still facing problems. We have to prove that an open democracy can tackle such problems. This is of utmost importance because we find ourselves in a true crisis of our open parliamentary democracies. At a technological level, I am very optimistic, but we also have to enthuse people. They have to accept change that they need to contribute to, and this is the true challenge. And this relates to the COVID-19 crisis. Secondly, today, a new president, hopefully, is elected in the US. So the question is, how do we deal with information, truth, and fake news? And what is the relationship between the academia and politics? We know that what we take for granted, that facts are nothing that is a matter of course right now in the US. So an open democracy and academia go hand in hand. They have to mutually influence each other. And last but not least, you said that I was the Under-Secretary of the UNEP. I was in Africa for 8 years because the UN Environment Programme has its seat in Kenya. There will be 2 billion people living in Africa soon, and we're talking about a young population, and they will need energy in order to create jobs. We're talking about our neighbors here, neighbors of Europe. So we need to be clear about what we're doing here in Europe, but the technologies that we develop here in order to achieve a carbon-free economy, and how far can this be exported? Can they be applied? Are they suitable to democracies? This is our litmus test 3. And what about the stance taken by politics and academia towards these questions? And last but not least, we have to think about our responsibility in a globalized world. And again, soon there will be 2 billion people living in Africa compared to 600 million in Europe. Of course, we can achieve a lot at a technological level. We are seeing considerable change. Anyway, the Austrian economist Schumpeter once said that there is such a thing as creative destruction, creative renewal, and we have seen this with regards to many aspects in industry. How can we achieve a double dividend? And I'm thinking of the means that we have to use in order to tackle the negative consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how can we make use of them in the sense of an environmentally friendly economy. Double dividend. This is important. I'm already quite old, but I would never have thought that 9 billion euros would be provided in Germany to develop hydrogen. If we would have asked for this a couple of years ago, people would have thought that we are mental. Now we are seeing 9 billion euros in the context of the Green Deal. So we have to fight this pandemic, and we need models for climate protection at the same time. The Green Deal is also related to the circular economy. And we could have debated this in a more nuanced way today, because the circular economy can be beneficial when it comes to achieving our climate goals. We have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic that decentralized and regional systems have become a priority. All out of a sudden, we talk about supply chains and supply networks. And this is of utmost importance, especially at a social level. I was very pleased to see a representative of L'Oréal here. The beauty industry has a problem with mica. Do you know about mica? This is a mineral that is sourced in India and that is used in cosmetic industry, but also in the automotive industry in order to generate a shiny texture. And there's a lot of child labor involved in India here when it comes to sourcing mica. What about cobalt? Again, this leads us to Africa, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, and to other countries. How can we solve these problems without a circular economy? Let me also talk about digitalization. Buildings are key, of course, but the building sector is also part of urban planning effects. All of a sudden, we realize that we can work from our home offices. We don't have to go to work anymore. And this will have negative effects on the demand for offices and office spaces in city centers. Mobility is replaced with digital availability. In the retail sector, we will see similar effects. Demand has become digital, but supply has been stationary. But this will be the other way around in the future. Delivery services go through the roof right now, and this will affect urban planning. We will see smart cities that we could not have imagined in our wildest dreams. All these are effects from the COVID-19 pandemic too. There's another aspect which has hardly been mentioned today, agriculture. Concerning the entire area of agriculture, food waste and other questions, we are talking about a socio-economic dimension. Without a transformation in agriculture, we will probably not reach our climate goals, or it will be very difficult. But at a European level, agriculture does not really figure in the debates. So we are talking about a huge imperative here. And the corona or COVID-19 pandemic has made it clear that we can only achieve this together. And I think that this is a very instructive insight. Let me now come to hydrogen. We are seeing a hype concerning hydrogen. And my experience from hypes has always been that you need to be prudent. People talk a lot before having thought through things. I think that we have to take this extremely seriously, and we have to invest much more in R&D. We think that electrolysis will be the solution here, but I'm not convinced of that. We might also want to think about pyrolysis. And again, circular models will be key here. We cannot only source energy from hydrogen, but we can also think about chemical carbon. So we can come up with concrete solutions. And the Paris Climate Agreement also knows Article 6. I'm talking about compensations here. This has to be further developed. Developing countries have to be involved in this. We're talking about a global task here. Because we are not talking about the problem of carbon emissions in Europe alone. No matter where carbon emissions are produced, they are harmful to the climate. And I was very pleased to hear Ms. Crozet talk about this. We should not only tackle this at a European level. No, this is not only a European responsibility. This would be disastrous, and this would not live up to our responsibility concerning climate policies. Human mankind has to stand together when it comes to COVID-19 and when it comes to other matters. So let's hope that with the US elections today, we will see a strengthening of multilateralism. Let's hope that academia is strengthened by this all around the globe. I think that we have seen that there is enough money if we need it. So let's use it in order to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic and in order to engage in climate protection. And that is why this conference is key at a geopolitical level. Congrats to the organizers. The Weimar Triangle will have to play a significant role at a European level, and this has also been the case in the past. Democracy can do so much more than any dictatorship. And this is true beyond the topics that we have talked about today. So let me thank you again for this conference. I hope that you will draw the commensurate conclusions. I've learned a lot today. You can't imagine how difficult it is to only listen and to not ask questions. I've tried to make some contributions too. Let me thank you again for the opportunity to talk here today. And I hope that you will think about all that you've heard here today. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Töpfer, for this great conclusion. This has been a decisive conference on a decisive day probably for the entire world. We are already at the end of the conference. And I think that it is very fitting that the Director for Digitalization of the Foreign Office will provide us with a closing statement. I think that this is very fitting indeed. Dr. Hinrich Tölken, he is director for the digital transformation. I hope that he can hear us. He's not only the director of digital transformation, he is also a qualified physician. He's also the director for international climate and energy policy. Until a couple of minutes ago, he took part in another conference, and I hope that he has already joined us. I can start talking. Ambassador, you have joined us. I pass the floor to you. Thank you so much. I'm not only responsible for digitalization, but also for international climate and energy policy at the Foreign Office. So I am delighted to give the closing statement. I find it intriguing that I've just taken part in a conference in New York. Now I have joined a conference in Berlin. Professor Dr. Töpfer, thank you so much for your inspiring conclusions concerning today's Energy Forum. What I've heard from your statement alone should be published and should be thought about thoroughly. I think that you have provided us with very important remarks indeed. Mr. Ressner, I would like to express my warmest gratitude to you and your team from the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, and to our colleagues at the Foreign Office and at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs for the outstanding organization of this year's forum. An online forum, very different from the past, but I think it has worked very well. Speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a long and inspiring day comes to a close, at least in the context of this forum. It will remain exciting in other contexts. Thank you for having participated in such high numbers. It would, of course, have been more pleasant and probably also more entertaining to participate in person and to engage in personal talks during the breaks. Instead, we are sitting in front of our computers or in front of smartphones, participating in this conference online. But you have made it till the end, and I think that this is thanks to this conference. I was particularly intrigued by the mixture of political and economic matters from Germany, France, Poland, and Europe. This stresses how important political basic conditions and the respective regulations are for economic players. Energy and climate matters should never be tackled at a national level alone, because we need to find bilateral, regional, and global responses to these challenges. We need to talk about social acceptance here, because it is a key question when it comes to the implementation of the energy transition and when it comes to climate protection, because we are also talking about redistribution. We're talking about interference in our cultures, and we're talking about the environment. And this is key when it comes to our dialogue with all stakeholders. I would like to emphasize once more how fitting the title of this year's Franco-German Energy Forum is. For all of us, the pandemic has been a paradigm shift, and this will remain so for quite some time to come. This can be seen from the mere fact that we have met online today. Moreover, the pandemic is a huge challenge for all European societies and national economies. In Germany, we call it the biggest challenge since the end of World War II, both at a social and economic level. We will only be able to master this in a collective great effort. However, in some respects, such paradigm shifts can also entail opportunities. With regards to energy and climate matters, and this is also suggested by the forum's title, the pandemic and the conclusions that policymakers and economic players draw from it can also entail the opportunity to pursue new and better approaches. Many contributions today touched on that. I very much hope that we can not only achieve an overall recovery, but a green recovery. Our energy industry has reached a crossroads. I very much hope that we will shift more decisively towards an energy transition, displaying global leadership here. To achieve this, we, policymakers, have to provide appropriate guidance. I very much hope that we will be successful, that we will be able to set the right parameters so that the German, French, Polish, and of course, above all, European energy industry can thrive in the future too, and I'm explicitly talking about the European Green Deal here. We try to do our share here, and I hope that one thing has become clear. The Franco-German Energy Forum is an important instrument that the federal government uses to try to live up to this responsibility. Another thing is clear too, though. As the EU, we are only responsible for around 9% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That is why our overall influence on the global energy transition is limited. However, we have to make progress when it comes to carbon neutrality, because we should perceive the energy transition as an opportunity for our national economies. European companies can set global standards and benefit economically from it. However, it is also key to be a role model for the rest of the world. The EU, and especially Germany and France, are role models for many regions in many ways. If we can show that this works, that the energy transition can be achieved, and that national economies can thrive in this transition, in spite of all structural changes involved in it, we will be able to encourage others to follow suit. As Director for International Climate and Energy Policy at the Foreign Office, I'm aware of the influential role that we, as Europe, as France and Germany, can play in the global energy transition. I have no doubt that we can achieve the transition towards a decarbonized world. However, to shape and to promote the European energy transition in a way that other continents and regions swiftly follow suit, this is what I consider as a much greater challenge and major responsibility for European diplomacy. It is not without reason that over the last years we have promoted a workshop series of European think tanks on the geopolitics of the energy transition. The academic findings of these workshops are to serve as input for the European External Action Service. The EU should live up to new external parameters, to buzzwords, Green Deal, new climate protection goals, and set itself a new energy diplomacy agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, the question in the end is not whether we can afford to engage in climate protection. The question is whether we can afford to not engage in climate protection. The consequences on national economies due to natural disasters would be immense. As representative of the federal government, I would like to emphasize in closing that as a transparent, open and pluralistic democracy, we of course also value external input when it comes to energy and climate matters. Constructive criticism, suggestions, all this helps us to adjust our political and regulatory actions. So let me end by encouraging you to get in touch with us anytime. We depend on the input from industry, from academia and other players. I would like to thank all participants and the organizational team once more. I very much hope that the Franco-German Energy Forum 2021 can take place in person again, in one and the same room, with real coffee and tea cups in order to enable even more exchange among you. I wish all of you a great evening. I will watch television tonight because I'm very excited about the US elections. I wish all of you a great week ahead. Thank you, Ambassador. And also thank you for hosting this event, even though the beautiful hall of the Foreign Office was a bit empty. But I didn't feel lonely because 870 people have participated in this forum. So let me express my gratitude to all of you. I would like to thank all speakers, the organizers, the co-organizers, and a special thanks goes to the interpreters. You have done an outstanding job. Thank you so much. The presentations that have been shown here today will be available to all participants. They will be published from next week, www.dfb.eu. This is the website of the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, and you will also get a summary sent to you via email. The Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition is already planning the next forum. It has already been set. Hopefully, it will be a bit more personal, making possible personal contacts. It will probably take place in June of 2021. See you then. I wish you all the best, and first and foremost, stay healthy.